Okay, so yes, and that's the reminder that we're being recorded. Before we start with the talk slash tutorial, a bit about myself. My name is Maite Taboada. I'm professor of linguistics at Simon Fraser University in Canada. We're sort of in the Vancouver area on the west coast. And I've been here at SFU for, I think, 20 years now, but I am from Spain. I did my PhD at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, and have worked at different universities in the United States and Canada, some stints in Germany and Spain as well. And what I'm going to talk about today is an overview of my research on discourse relations, also called Coherence Relations or Rhetorical Relations. My research really is at the interface of discourse and computational linguistics. So a lot of the research that I've done on discourse relations is about how to identify them, how to find them in text automatically. Another strand of my research, also overlapping discourse and computational applications, is in sentiment analysis, in finding out from a theoretical point of view, from a linguistic point of view, how people express sentiment and opinion in text, and from the computational point of view, trying to extract that information. We are working on some new projects with online data, with social media data, looking at the expression of evaluation online in social media, looking at how to moderate online comments, how to find misinformation. I have a lab with researchers and students who come and go. So a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today is collaborative, is with other researchers. But as I said, the focus today is on discourse relations, which is really my first love in research. The very first topic that I started with was discourse relations. I'll start by sharing my screen. I have some slides. I think the way we're going to do this is, I have slides. I'll discuss the slides as we go along. But I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. Please let me know if something goes wrong, if you cannot hear me, you cannot see the slides. But also feel free to put questions in the chat. About halfway through, the talk is divided into two sections, and about halfway through, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. Good. So finding discourse relations. What we are talking about is, see if I'm here. Yes, is discourse relations. So an outline of what I'll discuss is, first of all, what are discourse relations? And as I said, they have different names: rhetorical relations, coherence relations, conjunctive relations, discourse relations. I'll use mostly discourse rhetorical interchangeably, and then I'll talk specifically about rhetorical relations and rhetorical structure theory. So I'll start with an introduction to discourse relations, but really in this research area, the big questions that I want to answer is there a universal taxonomy of relations? Can we find a list of relations that we know are used in language and across languages? And the second big question is, how can we identify relations? How do we do that from a cognitive point of view, from the point of view of psycholinguistics and experimental linguistics? How do speakers identify those relations? And also from a computational point of view. Most of the discussion today will be from the cognitive point of view. So I'm going to give you a little taste of the answers to these questions. First, is a universal taxonomy of relations possible? Yes, if we agree to disagree. If we agree that we have slightly different approaches in different sort of schools of thought, but we are all working within the same phenomena, that the phenomena that we're studying are in a broad area between syntax and discourse. And the answer to the second question, how can we identify relations, is by considering all kinds of signals. I will argue that we have focused on conjunctions and discourse markers, things like if, because, however, to identify relations, but that there are all kinds of signals in language because we use all kinds of signaling devices to enhance communication and to achieve communication. So for the first question, what are rhetorical relations, discourse relations? In very, very brief terms, and I'll expand on some of these ideas later, what we're looking at is combinations of clauses at the basic level, at the sentence level. So you have main subordinate relations, what in traditional grammar you would call a main clause and a subordinate clause. For instance, if you want chocolate cupcakes, subordinate clause, add cocoa, main clause, right? So we can say that this relation may have a label condition. So these are relations within the sentence. The other type of relation that we're interested in is coordinate relations within the sentence. So these are relations where the two clauses or the two parts are presented at the same level of importance from the point of view of the speaker of the writer. These two units of information are equivalent in relevance and importance. So we call them coordinate relations. So an example here is a sequence relation. We start with the headline and then flesh out the story. So they are interdependent in that the second one needs to be second because it's a sequence, but they are presented as a sequence of steps at the same level of importance. The main thing in rhetorical relations and discourse is that these relations work at all levels of discourse. Right? So in both cases, in the main subordinate and the coordinate structures, these also occur across sentences. We can take that sequence relation and divide it into two sentences. We start with the headline, period, then we flesh out the story. And this is postulated as the main organizing principle of discourse. In grammaticalization studies, the idea is that main subordinate relations are the grammaticalization of these discourse relations across sentences, that we string ideas in discourse across sentences and across even paragraphs or turns in talk. And then we grammaticalize that, and perhaps we signal it with some very definitive signals, like an if for a conditional relation. So this is, in a nutshell, the phenomena that we are interested in here. Chunks of units of information that can be clauses, that can be sentences, that can be groups of sentences, and how they're related in discourse. So now that I've given you a bit of a taste of the linguistic phenomena, let me tell you sort of the plan for the tutorial. In the first part, I'm going to explain rhetorical relations. I'm going to discuss what rhetorical relations are. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about signaling. So to get at rhetorical relations, I'm going to start with coherence and texture, with concepts from systemic functional linguistics. And then I'll give an overview of how this idea of coherence relations has been treated in different schools of thought. And I'll focus on rhetorical structure theory, which is the framework that I work in, and how we can have a universal taxonomy. Then I'll have a little break here, and I'll go on to talking about signaling and what the signaling problem is, how we identify the relations, as I mentioned earlier, mostly cognitively, how we process discourse in terms of rhetorical relations. And then I'll describe a corpus study that we did with Debopam Das, one of my former PhD students, looking for signals in text. So for part one, again, I'm going to give you the main ideas before we start, and then I'll elaborate on them. for part one, when we talk about rhetorical relations, my main point is that rhetorical relations account for coherence in discourse. That when we say, this text or speech or conversation makes sense and this one doesn't, what we're saying is that they are coherent, and that coherence is brought about by discourse relations or coherence relations. And the second main point is that there are many different approaches to this, but the different approaches may be different only in the level of specificity, how abstract or concrete they make those relations. So those are the main ideas. Let me start with the idea of coherence in text. This is an idea in systemic functional linguistics in the work of Michael Halliday and Hasan, who are there in the picture. And texture is defined as the quality that makes a particular set of words and a particular set of sentences a text, what makes it discourse. And I'm going to use text and discourse interchangeably, and I'm going to say text, but by that I mean any instance of language, whether written or spoken. So language and context. And this set of words and sentences is related by relationships of choice. That's the systemic part in systemic functional linguistics, that you have systems of choice, that the language gives speakers systems of choice to communicate. And at any given point in the communication, we choose one thing or another. So, the speaker or writer uses those words and those relations across sentences over other choices. And that it's those choices that make the text meaningful in context. And this idea of texture is, in my view, one of the most beautiful metaphors in linguistics. When you think of text, the word text, and again, remember that I use text to mean spoken and written language, that word has the same root as texture and the same root as textile. According to the OED, a text is that which is woven, a web, a texture. So when you think of the metaphor, if you look, whatever fabric you're wearing, that fabric is made of two types of threads. There's the threads, you see a hand loom there, the threads that go vertically, and then we weave our horizontal thread through that. And that's where our concept of text comes from textile. And this is not my idea. This is, again, Halliday and Hasan's idea of coherence and cohesive relations in text that give that impression of texture, that impression of coherence in text. How do we achieve texture as speakers, as creators of text? So what we do is make discourse coherent in two different ways. Discourse is coherent is if all of the pieces of the discourse belong together and there's some common thread. Again, that metaphor of the thread comes up. When pieces belong together, what we have is coherence. We have relational coherence, we have rhetorical relations. When pieces have some common thread, what we have is cohesion, entity-based coherence. So the idea of pieces belonging together is ideas or propositions being connected in ways that make sense. Right? So a sequence, first you do this thing and then you do that thing. The pieces wouldn't belong together if you say, then you flesh out the story, we start with the headline. So it's the way that they are presented and the way that these two ideas have some common ideas. Those two propositions have some common ideas. The second part of coherence in discourse is the idea of a common thread. And threads are usually established in entities. right? So we start, so I have some in the text, I have some markings there. We start with the headline, and then we flesh out the story, right? So the we, the pronoun, is in both clauses, even though it's dropped in the second one. But we understand as speakers that that subject for flesh out is still we. So we have two entities there. These relations of cohesion, of entity, right? So this is entity-based coherence, are not limited to pronouns and the referential system in language. They also happen across lexical items. So headline and story are two lexical items that are related in the realm of journalism or writing. So lexical cohesion is a very important part of cohesion. So we have these two parts, right? The warp and the weft of text, the horizontal part of the text and the vertical part of the text, weaving those two things together. Given this weaving, it's not surprising that they overlap. So often we find entity relations are signals of coherence relations. So for instance, in a sequence relation or in most coordinate relations within the clause, the second subject can be dropped if it is the same subject. Elaborations are relations of both coherence and cohesion, and sometimes there is some discussion about whether they fit in one or the other. And some approaches like Vane's theory have used coherence to find the domain of reference, to so looking at coherence relations to look for anaphoric antecedents for pronouns. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about the first part, about relational coherence, about that coherence of propositions in discourse. But it's important to keep in mind that entity relations, that relations of cohesion, are also at work here. Sometimes in science, you have to reduce the object of study in order to really understand it well. But it's important not to lose sight of the other part of these coherence. Now, in the history of linguistics and text linguistics, there have been a number of approaches to, again, coherence relations, discourse relations, rhetorical relations. And there have been a number of attempts at unifying taxonomies. I haven't talked very much about the labels that we give those relations. So I have explained that there are relations, that there are two types, the main subordinate type and the coordinate type. But we have seen some examples of labels like condition or sequence or elaboration. I think I had an elaboration. So that is a taxonomy. The next step in studying relations is figuring out how many there are and what we're going to call them. And these attempts at unifying taxonomies have been, as Hovey and Meyer have put it, parsimonious or profligate. So you can have just a few labels, and the labels could be something like relations of addition or causal relations, or profligate where you have, I think one of the approaches has over 300 labels. And these approaches to the taxonomy sometimes are different in the starting point. Sometimes they start with Hallidayan metafunctions, ideational, interpersonal, textual. Sometimes they start with clause combination. So they're called paratactic or hypotactic. So paratactic is what we would call coordinate relations. I hope you can see my scribbles on the slides. Yes? Yeah, good. I see some people nodding. And hypotactic relations are called subordinate relations. And sometimes we use this paratactic, hypotactic to abstract away from the association of coordinate and subordinate to the clause level, to the sentence level. Sometimes the relations are classified according to whether they're subject matter, so they refer to things that are, or ideas that are external in the world, like causal relations, or presentational. They are internal to the text and to the presentation of the text. For instance, an elaboration relation is typically internal to the text because all you're doing is you have an idea and you have more specificity about that idea. Or a summary relation. You have a big chunk of text and then a small summary of that. But you could organize that differently. It's about presentation of information rather than about sort of realities in the world. Sometimes these are called external or internal relations. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of these approaches and some of these classifications, starting with the Halliday and Hasan approach. This I think is one of the most fundamental books in linguistics, and certainly in English linguistics, cohesion in English. And in cohesion in English, Halliday and Hasan divide relations into 4 categories. So this is this is a very busy table, but just a few things to point out here. Relations may be additive, adversative, causal, or temporal. And I think the labels can be quite transparent, right? So additive is just, and also, or adversative, things like yet, though, only, and but convey adversative, contrastive, concessive relations. Causal, so, because, for this reason, or temporal, organizing events in time. The rest of the table is not that as important. We have this sort of internal, external distinction. But what I want to draw attention to is the things in italics. So those are the signals that Halliday and Hasan used to say, these are the kinds of relations that you can find in text. They call them conjunctive relations, right? So you have and, or, so you can see that all of these relations are signaled, are indicated by some specific words. This was, the book was about English. These are specific words in English. If we look at the causal temporal, right? So if you're going to have a little bit more of a zoom in into this, in the causal temporal space, you see, so, then hence, consequently, for this reason, right? And then the very simple for, because. So this is, I think, the first classification that was exhaustive and approached the phenomenon from the point of view of coherence, from the point of view of texture. Then Jim Martin in English Text in 1992 sort of reorganized things a little bit. He had additive, comparative, temporal, and consequential relations. And you can see that internal, external distinction and the paratactic, hypotactic distinction. The interesting thing here is that some of the signals, some of the linguistic expressions that are used to identify a relation are not just words, right? So if, for instance, if you look at the similarity relation, you have equally, you have likewise, but you also have a syntactic pattern, a syntactic structure. So followed, this little caret means followed by a finite verb. In the purpose relation down here, you can have to descend, or modulation with so, in the condition modality with so. We're not going to go into modulation and modality, but expressions of modal verbs or modal adverbs, right? Plus the word so. So you can see that there is more syntactic structure here. And this brings me to an important point in functional approaches to language and in systemic functional linguistics, the distinction between congruent and metaphorical signaling. And this applies at all levels of the language. For instance, the congruent way of signaling an event is a verb. The metaphorical way of signaling an event is a noun. Nominalization is a metaphor, a grammatical metaphor. So, they are vaccinating people. So vaccinating would be the congruent realization of the event. And the metaphorical realization could be something like the vaccination campaign has started. So vaccination becomes a noun, it's not nominalized. When it comes to discourse relations, this distinction between congruent and metaphorical is really important. So the congruent realization Martin proposed is that we always have a conjunction. We have a because, if, and so, and or, and. The metaphorical realization is that we have other resources in the language deployed to signal, to tell the hearer reader, this is a relation, and this is how these two ideas or three ideas are related. So metaphorical realizations or metaphorical signaling could be circumstantial, so it could be a process, a verb, or specific words and phrases. For instance, the congruent realization could be by, and metaphorical could be enable. You register for your vaccination by going to this website, as opposed to this website enables the registration. So in this way would be congruent, through pointing out all that would be metaphorical, and so on, right? So let's look at condition, which I think is a little easier to see. The congruent is if, the metaphorical is the word condition, right? The judge will release the prisoner if they promise to come to parole hearings. And the metaphorical would be the judge will release the prisoner on the condition that they come. So, this, I'm going to skip over a little bit of the rest of the ages. This has been re-elaborated and changed and really thought through very carefully. Halliday and an Introduction to Functional Grammar, which is 85. The first cohesion in English was 76. This is 85. Had a bit of a different entry point, the type of expansion that the relations enable, like elaboration, extension, or enhancement. Then the next few editions of Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, the last two have been written with Christian Mathieson, have slightly different configurations of this, right? So you have elaborating, extending, and enhancing, and different types of relations. And this looks very complicated, but really it's just a way of organizing the space of coherence relations. And that's what creating a taxonomy is. Creating a taxonomy involves organizing the world or the concepts in a particular way. So the particular ways are not so important. The main point is that we have been working on this for a very long time. We have been working on how to organize relations and what to call them. So this is my summary of the different approaches and the space of coherence relations. The main thing here in this slide is that there's sort of two poles of the distribution, whether you start from the syntax, whether you base the classification on the syntactic structure, on the conjunctions, on the main subordinate structures, or you start your organization on the discourse. The more general organizations, for instance, an entire text and its summary. So that's, could be 3 or 4 paragraphs on the summary and it are in a summary relation. So that's more at the discourse level, at the level of text types and genre. And you can often identify genres by the types of structures, by the type of discourse relations that they include. So the typical structure of newspaper articles as inverted pyramid scheme with general lead, general explanation of the event or news item and more details is really an organization of discourse relations. So the genre and the discourse relations go hand in hand. So that's the main point here, that we can start from the bottom up, from the syntax up, or we can start from the top down, from the discourse. I put discourse and syntax as top and bottom, but also that's also somewhat arbitrary. And the bars that you see here, the different names, are different approaches to this. We have discussed Halliday and Hasan. We have discussed Martin a bit, and there are many others. But the ones here on the left of the slide are all approaches that start at the syntax. As I said, Halliday and Hasan in Cohesion in English looked at conjunctions and very specific expressions. Right? So it was very much based on the syntax, on the grammar of the language. Now, Martin, I've made it a little higher up because remember I said there were other things that Martin thought were metaphorical signals for discourse relations, like in this way, or so followed by a verb. Right? So it's going a little bit above just the conjunctions. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we have approaches that kind of start from the discourse. So Hobbes and Keller is very much an organization of text and ideas. Asher and Laskaridis, I think this is SDRT, Segmented Discourse Representation Theory, is kind of encompasses everything. The theory that I'm going to talk about the most is rhetorical structure theory. Mann and Thompson is the sort of foundational text of that theory. And you can see it's more at the discourse level, but I think it can encompass everything. My main point in this talk is that we all work in some space here. We all know that that space needs to be studied. And the main difference is that some people tend towards the discourse level, are more focused on the discourse level of that space, and some people are more focused on the syntax or lexical-grammar level of that space. But that we can, as I said at the beginning, we can agree to disagree on the labels, we can agree to disagree on how much of the space we occupy, but the phenomena are all the same. Okay, so we're still in part one. What I'm going to discuss now is rhetorical structure theory. I'm going to give you an overview of the theory, and then I'll pause at the end of part one to see if there are any questions or discussion. Okay, RST. This is what an RST diagram looks like. Again, these are abstractions, so you can draw them many different ways. But let's have a quick look at this text. This is a little extract from a book review. This is the 6th book in the Stephanie Plum series. If you have never had the fun of reading a book in this series, do not start with this one. Go to the library and start with One for the Money and work your way up to Hot 6. I don't know these books, but I've read reviews of them. This little text is not the entire review. There's more, but this is the beginning of the review. It's organized you can look at the organization in different ways. You can look at it from the bottom up, right? And you can say, oh, this is clearly a sequence, right? The author is saying, do this, and then do this, and then do this, right? And the sequence has to be taken in those steps. Also from the bottom up, you can see, there's an if there. That's a condition relation. You can also look at it from the top down. You can see that, this is the 6th book in the Stephanie Plum series, prepares you to understand the rest of the text. And this background relation is one that you may not have seen before, that you may not be as familiar with in terms of the label, but of course it's a relation that you have encountered many times in texts. Texts often start with this, with some kind of like, you need to understand this before I tell you everything else. And then the other way in which this text is organized is with a contrast relation. So the contrast divides this text in two. It's the 6th book, do not start with this one. The contrast is read the other ones first. So when I teach about RST, I always find that it's easier to start with a text. You see the text, you see the relations. I hope they're clear to everybody, including the ones that are perhaps less familiar, like background and contrast, because those are the more abstract ones, perhaps the ones that we don't look at so much because we mostly look at relations in the syntax and the grammar. And the point of a rhetorical structure theory is to account for coherence in text through these relations, to explain text as being made up of relations. And one other important thing, or a couple of other important things, is that we have this distinction between hypotactic relations, right? So those are the relations like condition, where we have a main part of the relation and a subordinate part of the relation. These are called nucleus and satellite to abstract away from the syntax. And then we also have these relations that in RST typically are signaled with straight lines that are paratactic. Those are the coordinate type of relations. So that's, those relations exist at the lower level, at the within the sentence level, and at the higher level of discourse. And of course, because they are at the higher level of discourse, what we encounter is recursion. We use these types of structures over and over again, and they encompass bigger and bigger chunks of the discourse. So once we have this, 2, 3 here, this is 2 and this is 3 unit in the text, we make them a unit. So now this conditioned relation is a unit. It's the sentence, that starts with if and ends with a period. And this unit can be part of another unit. And this is a very common phenomenon in language, right? We use recursion at all levels in language. So of course we use it in discourse. So these are the main ideas, that we have hypotactic and paratactic relations, and that these relations are recursive. So RST is firmly at the discourse end of the cline when we look between discourse and syntax. It's agnostic to the syntactic shape of discourse components that are called spans or EDUs. In more specific approaches, then you look at clauses or sentences. But in RST, a clause, a sentence, and a paragraph have the same status. Their difference is that the clause does not have further internal structure and the paragraph does. And RST said clearly there are 2 types of relations. There are the more grammaticalized relations, more the syntactic end. Those are the subject matter relations, like if type of relations, and less grammaticalized, more the discourse end, more the presentational type of relations that are about how you organize ideas. But of course, some subject matter relations occur across sentences and paragraphs. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. So now finally, we're getting to the taxonomy. So this is one proposal for a taxonomy within RST. And these are the labels that are typically used in RST relations. So in the subject matter end, we have relations like circumstance, conditional, elaboration, evaluative, means. In the presentational end, we have relations like concession, background, enabling, evidential, and so on. The labels vary a bit. There are different approaches. There is what is called classical RST with the relations from the original paper and some changes. But this sort of gives you an idea. The list of labels is manageable. It's something that you can find in text, that you can identify easily. The definitions can be explained. I'm not going to give definitions, firm definitions today, because that's going into too much detail. But I think most of the labels are transparent. Some of them, like for instance, enabling, may take a little bit more explanation. So this is the sort of the list of relations that we usually work with. This is the taxonomy. I'm going to talk about a couple of other things that happen in RST. One of the constraints is connectedness, that when you have a text, you typically have a single tree for the text. That is, all the parts of the text are connected. With conjunctive relations, you don't necessarily have a tree. You can capture an entire text, but relations may be more personal, more local. Personally, I don't think connectedness needs to apply to every time to every text and to every chunk of text. I have found this, especially in analysis of conversation, that sometimes you have chunks of the conversation that are not entirely related to each other than they're happening between the same people and in the same space. But they're sequential. But you can move through different chunks of text in a conversation that are not entirely connected. The other constraint is nuclearity. Many approaches to discourse from all walks of life, from all theoretical, whether formal or functional, postulate that salience is an important feature in discourse and in language, right? You have approaches to focus and topic. You have relevance, right? So this idea of salience, that there are more and less important parts of the discourse, is a feature of RST. Sometimes relations may be left underdefined as to how nuclearity applies, but in most cases you have a nucleus satellite structure, right? So there's a more important and less important part, and you know, some relations are multinuclear, are of the coordinate type. And the evidence that this salience exists in text, that is a fundamental property of discourse, is in the grammaticalization. This nucleus satellite distinction at the discourse level has been grammaticalized in the main subordinate clause structure that many clauses in language and many languages feature. Now, speaking of languages, how has RST been applied across languages and across different types of text? So, you know, range of texts, including conversation, initially thought to be difficult. This is what I did for my dissertation in English and in Spanish, to a range of languages, many of them Indo-European languages, but also Chinese, or, you know, Mandarin, I think mostly Japanese, Arabic. And unlike other approaches, it didn't need substantial changes because the level of abstraction that RST implies is the level that you find at the discourse level. It has also been extended. This is some work that I did a while back with Christopher Havel at the University of Hamburg, but that John Bateman and others have done as well, is extend the relations between clauses and between sentences and paragraphs to relations between text and multimodal material, or even within multimodal material. So you can analyze an entire image through RST because the image has parts that are in some kind of relation. There are lots of corpora for RST, as I said, some of them in other languages. The RST Discourse Tree Bank is one of the most popular ones. For German, there's the Potsdam Commentary Corpus. There's a corpus in Portuguese. Iria Acuña at the UNED, the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, in Spain has created a corpus for Spanish. Together with Iria Acuña and Mikel Uruzquieta at the Universidad del País Vasco, University of the Basque Country, we did a Basque Spanish-English parallel corpus and that we use for methodology for interannotator reliability. And the Georgetown multilayer corpus that I had some examples, my first examples were from this corpus also, is a corpus that is growing. Amir Seldes at Georgetown is growing that all the time. So this is kind of the introduction to RST, but what we wanted to do, and we is Farah Ben Amara at the Université de Toulouse in France, we wanted to do a universal hierarchy, a hierarchy that worked across languages and across approaches. And we started with how to select relations. We wanted to be parsimonious. We wanted to have only a few classes at the top level that were very clear and that would work across all languages. But, you know, that is stable enough for language variation, right? You can add or delete relations if you find that the language or the genre that you're studying has different relations. And that we could map relations across approaches. So currently our mapping works very well for RST and SDRT, the Segmented Discourse Representation Theory of Asher and Laskarides, but other approaches can be added. We had criteria for this taxonomy, the status of arguments, nucleus of satellite, the focus, whether it's on the effect or not. And the rationale for this criteria is that discourse markers can be ambiguous and they're not reliable across languages. So different languages have different ways of signaling the discourse relations. And our definition, and this is something that I haven't talked about very much, is that we focus on the effect. What is the effect that the speaker or writer wants to convey with this relation, with presenting information in this particular way? I'm going to skip some of these details, but, you know, we merge different relations, you unify segmentation principles, define the set, specify the type of relation, and provide a unified language. This is formalized, right? So we map different definitions. Sometimes, a relation A in one approach A corresponds to several relations in approach B. Okay, so with this, I just want to give you an idea of what the taxonomy looks like. I'm not going to spend very much, I'm not going to use a lot of time defining it, but our proposal is that coherence relations come in three flavors at the very high level. They are temporal, they're thematic, or they're causal argumentative. This goes well with psycholinguistic and psychological approaches to reality. As human beings, we tend to see the world in terms of parts that are related, and those parts are either additive or causal, right? We see events as causal. We see things and entities are as additive. And as human beings, we also care a lot about time and progression of time. So we think that, temporal relations, relations where you can add, elaborate, summarize, and so on. Thematic relations are fundamental to how we perceive reality and how we talk about that reality in language. And then the other very important part of our cognition and how we see the world and how we talk about it is causal relations. So I have slides with each one of the three top structures. I'm just going to go through them so that they're in the recording as well for later, and you can pause. But these are the three temporal relations we propose, or the three high-level temporal relations. The thematic relations are the ones that perhaps need a bit more explanation because they're kind of more text internal. They're about how we organize ideas, things like elaboration, summary, or restatement. And the causal relations, causal argumentative, we think is a big category, but then we divide it into causal, like cause, result, purpose, or argumentative, right? Support and opposition. And this is the basis of, for instance, argumentation theory or how we organize ideas. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, the proposal for a taxonomy. There's other efforts in this space. There was a European Union project, cost action, called ExLing, chaired by Lisbeth Degan and Bonnie Weber. And the idea there is to provide a unified taxonomy, a set of tools, and a list of all the discourse markers in different languages with a multilingual emphasis. So the website is up there and it has a lot of those resources. In summary, for part one, what I hope to have shown is that we can probably agree to disagree as to the level of abstraction for relations. Most people work at least in the middle of that discourse syntax space, and some people work more towards the discourse and some people more towards the syntax. But for individual cases, for individual projects, for individual languages or genres, you can decide how much or how little detail is needed. What we have proposed with Farab and Amara is a universal taxonomy. It still needs some refinement, a full mapping of all relations across different theories. And this is something that I encourage people to work on. We have a proposal, we have a paper out there, but more work can be done. When we got to this point, what we realized that the next most important task was to examine how the relations we propose are realized. If these relations exist in discourse, if they are cognitive entities that speakers and hearers use to process language, then they must be signaled. We must have a way of saying, oh, when I'm talking to you and you're saying this, what you mean here is a causal relation. When I'm reading this text, what this author intended was an elaboration relation. So there must be some signal that tells us how these relations are structured and how they're conveyed in language. And that is the focus of the second part. The second part of the talk, I'm going to discuss signaling rhetorical relations. But perhaps what I'll do here is I'll stop sharing. Take a little break, you can stretch. I'm going to have a drink of water, and I welcome questions, comments, ideas up to this point.
Yes, whoever has a question, you can press at the reactions button and select the raise hand so we can assign you. Okay. Antonis, please. Your microphone is off. Yeah.
Thank you. So far, I think we have two things clear. The one, what we know several decades now, that language is equal to discourse. Language is, for example, a discourse issue. And the second one, and thank you, something I've never thought, it's that all those small function words we traditionally did not pay attention. The main thing was contents words who carry stress as well. The other small words, it's something like between, so to connect something maybe necessary but not important. And I've got the feeling, in accordance with your presentation, that those small words are actually very important and define relations in discourse, which is language, which is an upgraded of the importance of function words. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, I agree to both. Language is discourse. Language is contextual, contextual and embodied. And as I said, sometimes we reduce language to small parts to study it, right? And of course, you know, phoneticians reduce language to sounds, but those sounds always occur in context. And the second part, yes, function words. And what I'm going to show you in the second part is that it's not just function words, but many other things that we use to stitch together discourse relations. And I think in linguistics and also in teaching of language, teaching of second languages, we have a haphazard approach to these function words. We teach students, you know, I teach when I teach discourse classes. Sometimes I teach students RST as a way to improve their writing. Because sometimes in writing instruction, when we teach ESL or any other language as a second language, we say, oh, you know, use if here and however, and remember to use on the one hand, on the other hand. But we teach it as at a very micro level, not as a way to organize language. Those little words, those function words, what they do is they organize language and they organize ideas. And if we taught a little bit more from that abstract level, I think it would be we'd get much better writers, for sure. In academic discourse, that's the case.
Let's now say, let's agree. My feeling up to I heard these, your words, was that the function words, they have a local function, but as you say, they have a discourse function, which is a global function. So we go from local to more or less global. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Christina?
Christina, yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, it's a pleasure to see you because I have been using your research very recently in my publications. My name is Christina Alexandris. I'm a computational linguist, and I work mainly with spoken political and journalistic texts, and I'm also the head of a laboratory in the European Communications Institute. So I don't have any specific question because I have already used your recent papers in some of my work. Just a big thank you for everything that you're doing, although I'm more on the spoken part and I work on other aspects of language, not the strictly formal ones. And I'm happy to see you. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Happy to hear that the research was useful. Perhaps, you know, offline later, you can tell me more about the work where you're doing. I stopped doing work on spoken discourse. That's what I did for my dissertation, and I did a bit later. But I'm very interested in political discourse, and I have a student right now, Lucas Chambers, who's doing research on speeches and the discourse of populism as well. So it'd be great to hear more about what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a challenging task. I mean, I was recently on your part. I presented such work at Stanford, and also in 2017 at Vancouver, on your where you are located right now.
Oh, at ACL?
No, at the HCI, Human Computer Interaction.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Okay,
Shall I perhaps go on to part 2?
Yes, I think you can continue now. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, part 2, if you still have the stamina, bear with me on a hot Friday afternoon. At least it's hot here. Good. One more thing to set up. Yeah. So going on to the signaling problem, rhetorical relations, not just those little function words, but many other ways in which we signal information. The main points in this second part are that signaling is very, very common, and that it includes other things like conjunctions or more generally discourse markers. Let's talk about signals. So there's often a distinction between what are called unsignaled, unmarked, implicit, or underspecified relations. I can have these 2 sentences. Tom quit his job. He was tired of the long hours. And you probably assume a relation there. And if you were to label that relation, you'll probably say a causal relation. You can make this relation explicit. You can make it signaled, marked, explicit. Right? You can say things like Tom quit his job because he was tired of the long hours. So the very, very interesting thing in discourse relations or rhetorical relations is that we often have the little function word. We often have because, but many, many times we don't. We have the first sentence and we still perfectly understand the relation. So I'm very interested in what happens in that first example. Why do we assume a causal relation? And what in the text tells us that there is a causal relation? There are many explanations for this. One of them is, as I said earlier, that we kind of fundamentally see the world as actions and events and causes, or sequences, right? Temporal. But, if you don't say it, there must be a reason why we don't say it, right? We tend to express things in the most succinct way, especially in speech. So what's going on there? The other interesting thing with unsignaled relations is that what they do is they create an implicature. Tom quit his job, he was tired of the long hours. I'm creating an implicature across those sentences that there is a causal relation. But with unsignaled relations, that implicature can be canceled. I can present this as 2 events, one after the other, but cancel the implicature. Tom quit his job, he was tired of the long hours anyway. That little word anyway tells me, do not assume a causal relation. There is another reason. Right? So I've always found this problem fascinating. And this is a fascination that Bill Mann had for a very long time. A lot of his later writings on rhetorical structure theory had to do with the signaling problem. Mann and Thompson, and the original paper in '88, and I should say I'm using the Bill Mann and Sandy Thompson paper, but Christian Mathisen was also a big part in the creation of RST. But this sort of paper that describes it all says that there's no reliable, unambiguous signals for any of the relations. And when we are looking for these signals, many researchers have focused on connectives or discourse markers, right? I prefer to use signals because that abstracts away a little bit more. We're not looking at markers or conjunctions, there are signals. we have over the years done many studies of signaling, and the signaling, the frequency varies. But for instance, in previous work in German, 39% of the relations were found to be signaled, to be marked. The RSD website, actually, we have a lot of texts there, very mixed genres, all in English, and there are about 28% signals. In conversation, this is a study that I did a long time ago now, in 2006, 31%, and in newspaper articles, 43%. So what we find here is that in many of the cases we have studied, the majority of the relations are not signaled. Right? In my view, that is a bit of a problem, or maybe not. Let's go back to Grice and the cooperative principle. Grice said that the cooperative principle basically consists of the principle that you make your contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. And this principle is expressed in maxims. I'm interested here in the quantity maxim that says, make your contribution as informative as is required and not more. If we assume, we're going to do a few assumptions here, if we assume that speakers work under the cooperative principle, then unsignaled relations are unsignaled because the signal is not necessary. So they may be more difficult to process, and there's lots of experimental research saying that in certain conditions and with certain levels of reading ability, whether first or second language reading ability, signals help or not. Right? So the relations may be more difficult to process, but under the cooperative principle, not impossible, because we make our contribution as informative as required and not more. So when I say Tom quit his job, he was tired of the long hours, I don't put a because there because is not required, because I assume that you can process that relation without the signal. And that brings us to the other point, whether coherent relations are cognitive entities, right? Apparently they are. There's psycholinguistic evidence that we see them, right? We may not label them, but we see them, we understand them, we recognize them. This is kind of the same psycholinguistic research that tells us that there's a structure in sentences, that the specific tree and how we parse the tree, whether we have, a inflectional phrase or a complementizer phrase in a sentence or not, is hard to tell from psycholinguistic evidence, but there's evidence that structure is there, that when we parse sentences, we understand structure. The same principle applies to coherence relations. When we parse text, we apply structure to it. Then the implication is that when we produce text, we produce structure on it. So if relations are cognitive entities, I'll keep going with the assumptions, they must follow the cooperative principle because they're recognized by hearers and readers, right? So, when there's no signaling, when I don't have the because for a causal relation, do we interpret the relations correctly? There are two possible answers, I think, to this. One is that no, we don't correctly interpret the relation. No signaling means there's no relation, or the relation is underspecified, and we're not quite sure what the speaker or writer meant. My answer, my preferred answer, is that yes, relations are interpreted in the absence of signaling. And when we say no signaling, what we mean is that they're signals, but we have overlooked them in our research. We have only been looking at conjunctions. We have only been looking at function words, but many other things are going on in text. So signaling, I would propose, has been understudied, mostly connectives, conjunctions. And my hypothesis is that there are no or very few true implicit relations. So what we set out to do was to test this hypothesis empirically. For any given relation, can we find signals? And this led us to a large corpus study. This was work with De Bopamdas, who was a PhD student here at SFU and now is at Humboldt University in Berlin. And what we did was we took this discourse tree bank, a collection of Wall Street Journal articles. They're very old articles. I know a lot about Reagan's policies because these are articles from the 80s, but it's okay. It's language and it hasn't changed that much. And this is 385 articles, 176,000 words, and it was annotated independently by somebody else, by Daniel Marco and Lynn Carlson and other people, with rhetorical relations, about 17,000 relations. So we took this corpus that somebody else had annotated. Somebody else had said, there's a relation here. And we wanted to find the signals. So the process is we set up the annotation. We created a taxonomy of signals. Selected the annotation, we annotated, and we extracted information. We annotated this corpus that is now available from the Linguistic Data Consortium. I think in some cases you have to pay for the corpus, but contact me if you're interested. And we have two publications describing the corpus. These are already a few years old. One describing the signaling itself and the signals that we found, and the other one mostly describing how we compile the corpus. Briefly, what we did is we used UAM Corpus tool, an annotation software. So we got this was in the RST discourse tree bank already. This kind of structure was there. We took that at face value. We said, this is a structure that somebody else has said is in this text. And then we loaded it into annotation software and we said, okay, what are the features of this relation? This relation, somebody has said, is a textual organization relation. We say, well, yes, it has a signal. The signal is single. It's a discourse marker, and the discourse marker is and. So we included that in the annotation. What did we use as signals? And I think this is the key to this work. We use discourse markers, conjunctions, adverbials, prepositions, like things like for this reason. That is a prepositional phrase, but used as a function phrase. But we used a whole bunch of other signals that I think have been understudied. Reference, so personal reference, demonstrative reference, lexical relations, semantic relations like synonyms and antonyms. And especially this part brings us to cohesion. Brings us to the concept in Halliday and Hasan of the other side of texture. I've been talking about coherence and coherence relations, but remember the other side is relations among entities in the text. So personal pronouns that are repeated, anaphoric relations, and lexical relations like synonymy or antonymy. Like in the example that I had at the very beginning, it was something about the headline and the story. So headline and story tell us that those sentences have some relation. And then we have some more syntactic relations like morphology, tense, syntactic structures, like relative clauses are often relations of elaboration. So you have a noun and you elaborate, you say something else about that noun. Parallel structure, can be relations of, general parataxis, general coordination. But other things like graphical information, a colon, a dash, a bullet, even the layout. We didn't study layout because we have raw text, but in many texts, the layout tells us a lot about the relationship between parts. Headlines, bold, those little sidebars, right? And we also consider some of the genre characteristics of, because this was newspaper discourse, of newspaper articles like the pyramid scheme. Let me give you a few examples of how this works. My mouse just fell. Okay, examples of signaling. These examples are a bit long, so I won't read them all, but a concession relation. Some entrepreneurs said the red tape they most love to hate is red tape, that they would also hate to lose. They concede. So we have a concession relation indicated by the word concede. All right. Concede is not a function word, but clearly, just like the word condition, on the condition that is an indicative of a conditional relation. Temporal relations, of course, we have after, before, while, but we also have prepositional phrases like at the same time. A few more examples of lexical of signaling. For instance, lexical chains. So relations, lexical relations in the text. The Commerce Department says go, and the Defense Department says stop. We have a conjunction here, and, but and is the most underspecified conjunction there is. You put ands everywhere and they signal all kinds of things. But what we have here is a go and a stop. So those are relations of antonymy indicating a contrast. With elaboration, also you get lexical chains, right? So slump, drop, fell, and dismal results, or all are related in a lexical chain in this context of stock prices. And just one more example of signaling: punctuation. This is a series of elaborations, and you see a parenthesis and two dashes, right? So the parenthesis tells me this whole unit elaborates on this unit, and the dashes tell me that this unit elaborates on this unit. So this was the annotation. We looked at signals, whether they were simple or combined, and whether they were simple. These are the 8 main classifications: discourse markers, reference, lexical, and so on. And so, you know, there's more more specific, right? So for instance, the reference is pretty big. The syntactic is quite large. We have relative clauses, infinitival clauses, participial clauses, WH clauses, and so on, that are syntactic signals of relations. So examples, we had single relations. So for instance, to encourage more competition among exporting countries, blah, blah, blah. So what was given to us was the relation. So this is a purpose relation. And what we added to the corpus was the type of signal. This is an infinitival clause, right? And everybody recognizes that: to encourage or in order to encourage. Gerald C. Bennell, blah, 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 he. So the relation here is elaboration, and the signal is personal reference plus subject MP. So we have Gerald C. Bennell and he. Those are the cohesion relations, the reference relations in text, but they tell us something about how these two things are related. It's both the personal reference and the fact that they're both subject MPs. So this is a combined signal. And then some of them we were unsure, and I'll talk more about that. Sometimes we just left it as unsure. We did a reliability study to make sure that the annotations were reliable. You know, in summary from this slide, we had moderate agreement. We annotated 21, well, I say we, the BOPAM for the most part annotated 21,000 relations. Sometimes we had to split some relations into 2, so it's a bit more than the original RSD discourse tree bank. And almost 30,000 signals, 30,000, you know, discourse markers, syntactic structures, graphical signals. Okay, and results finally. 2 parts to this table. So we have different types of signaling. So in the first part, we have relations exclusively signaled by a discourse marker. Again, a conjunction or a prepositional phrase that has been grammaticalized, like on the one hand or the other hand, we consider those discourse markers. We had about 2,000, so 10%, almost 11%. Relations exclusively signaled by other things, so just the personal reference or just the lexical chain, no discourse markers involved, 15,000, about 75%. And combined, sometimes it's discourse markers and other things, 7%. So the main number here is that 92.7% of the relations in the corpus were signaled. This is way bigger than any other study has shown. Why? Because we included all kinds of signals. And then we had about 7% of the relations that were implicit. We call them unsignaled, and I'll discuss those. I'll give you a bit more of results. By signal, we had relations that had mostly discourse markers and relations that mostly did not. So we have 2 categories there. So circumstance, result, condition, right? often appeared with discourse markers and relations that often appeared without discourse markers. So attribution, background, different types of elaboration. Relations that typically appeared with other signals, signals that were not discourse markers, attribution, background, comparison, and relations without other signals, condition, right? So condition is mostly discourse markers and mostly no other things. In terms of relations and discourse markers, so a relation like list, for instance, has a set of common discourse markers. So out of the 800 instances of list, vast majority of them had and. By contrast, so this is starting with the relation as the entry point. By contrast, if we start with the marker as entry point, the word and appeared over 1,000 times. And it appeared in list, as we see above, but also in elaboration and sequence and consequence and circumstance and so on. So I think the point of this slide is that there's no one-to-one mapping. So relations have all kinds of signals. Signals belong in all kinds of relations. Maybe I'll skip this one. So some relations that had other signals than discourse markers. A lot of signaling was done through multiple signals. So 92% were at least one signal or more. And quite frequently, relations had 2 or 3 signals. And as I said earlier, there's sometimes in some relations a nearly one-to-one correspondence, condition almost always if, attribution almost always syntactic, right? Attribution is a reported speech relation, but most often one-to-many. So circumstance can have a discourse marker, it can have a lexical indicative word, can have morphology, a tense, and so on. Okay, so to summarize, to discuss, the vast majority of relations, over 90%, are signaled. So signaling is not just discourse markers, it's not just conjunctions. They're varied. There are 9 types of single signals and multiple. About 37% of the relations have more than one signal. So going back to that texture, we have these relations of coherence that are relations among propositions, but we use cohesion. We use a lot of the other resources in the language as well to signal the relations. So coherence and cohesion intimately connected to make that texture that language and discourse displays. I have one caveat though, implicit relations. There are about 1,500, 7% of the relations, we could not find a signal. There are 3 main reasons why this happens. Number 1, we think there's an error in the annotation. The annotators postulated a relation, but there's no real relation there. Number 2, questionable discourse relations that are not included in the original taxonomy and that I think are not really relations, rhetorical relations in the proper sense, like things like comment or topic shift. So number 1 and 2 are, I think, artifacts of the annotation. Remember, we just took the annotations. It's a really well annotated corpus. This is not a criticism, but sometimes the way you approach the annotation influences the results. And number 3 is that sometimes as annotators, we say, one of these things could be a signal. Sometimes there are entity relations that are very, very tenuous, right? If you use like a thesaurus or wordnet or something like that, this word is here and this word is here, you can find a path to the word, right? But the path is maybe 10 notes long, and you think, well, is that really a semantic relation? It's not clear. Sometimes it's world knowledge. So knowing something about, for instance, how cities and countries and companies are related helps establish an entity relation, but it was hard to really anchor that relation to a particular signal. So there may be some implicitness. That's probably the ambiguity that exists in language. Of course, we don't always understand each other perfectly well all the time. We leave things implicit, but for the most part, discourse relations are not implicit, is what I want to say. 92% of the time, they're not. So in summary, a variety of signals for annotation, variety of relations for each signal. Clearly, there's no one-to-one mapping, and we seem to resolve these ambiguities in discourse. So signaling seems to be quite widespread. My general conclusion is that rhetorical relations are relations of coherence. They occupy this space between discourse and syntax. Clearly, there are fewer signals than we have acknowledged. There are fewer implicit relations. And it's possible that there are no implicit relations at all. We've tried to show this with this large scale corpus study of local and global relations and a large set of signals. So to wrap up, I'll just go back to my original questions, big questions about what are discourse relations. I hope that I have been able to provide a good answer to what discourse relations are. The second question, whether it's possible to have a universal taxonomy of relations, I think yes, the answer is yes. If we agree that in some cases, some projects, some researchers are going to look at more level of detail and some researchers are going to be more interested in more abstraction. And relations can be identified by considering all kinds of signals. We have been very selective in the signals that we use, but language consists of many, many other signals. The one thing I haven't mentioned is in speech, we use other things than language, right? Like gestures and face expressions. And I think in speech and in face-to-face communication, those can also be signals. And you know, of course, sign language has shown that you can organize language around gesture. In spoken languages, that is sort of parallel to the language, but gesture plays an important role in how we interpret language in face-to-face communication. I have a couple of slides full of references. I'm not sure they're going to be readable, but of course you can always contact me about references or resources. And my contact information is there, email, Twitter, my webpage, the page of the Discourse Lab, and a lot of the computational work that we do and a lot of the resources that we produce are available on our GitHub space as well. So that's the end of the presentation. And yeah, I'd be very happy to answer more questions, to engage in discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please click on the reactions icon and then choose raise hand.
Antonio, so nice to see you.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Maite. Yeah, thanks for your very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I have this question. Well, I have to say I really like your signals approach to identifying rhetorical relations rather than, you know, discourse markers alone, because I think it opens a world of possibilities for the computational treatment of discourse. I mean, even if we discard those unmarked implicit relations, like those based on world knowledge, it's fine. I mean, I'd be happy to get over 92% accuracy. That would be great. However, I still think that many of those signals are very, let's say, ethereal. They are not very easy to grasp. They don't have, you know, some material, some embodiment. For example, those semantic signals are not easy to compute. I mean, I don't know, we could use word embeddings, for example, to handle those. But still, I'm not sure how well that will play out. So my question is, do you think that a sufficiently large manually annotated corpus would ever be, you know, successfully used as training data? And how
Yes.
big would it be?
Yeah, excellent question. I don't think our corpus is large enough because it suffers from imbalanced data, an imbalanced data problem, right? So some relations have a lot of examples, some signals have a lot of examples, but there's some that have fewer. Now, there have been approaches to this problem. You know, we embarked on this project with the idea of building a discourse parser. And then many other people worked on this space, and we abandoned that idea and we focused on the corpus side. But for instance, Caroline Sporletter and our Alex Lascarides did a study on Mirella Lapata, I think was involved in that as well, as possible. I have the references somewhere. Did a study of what differentiates signaled from unsignaled relations and how you can find them automatically. I think lexical chain computing is a problem that is, perhaps not solved, but very well studied, right? So we can compute lexical chains, and we can use lexical chains to identify relations. We can, of course, use the markers. We're very good with parsing right now, so we can use the information in the syntax. I haven't seen work on using word embeddings yet. I wish somebody took up this problem, because I think you could look at it from that point of view, and then perhaps you would need a little less annotated data. I don't think is going to be even 90% accurate, but I think we can get much further than we have gotten thus far with even lightly annotated. So some kind of semi-supervised approach would give us pretty good results, and especially at the more local level, right? So it's hard to identify more global relations in the text, but local relations, I think, are easily identifiable.
Excellent, thanks. And thanks for being so optimistic. Great.
Yeah. Well, research is fun and everybody should participate, right? So I think there's lots to do in this space.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, any more questions, please? Okay, Antonis.
Thank you. Well, I've heard so many interesting things, and I've noted one and another here, but I'm confused with what I've noted. Anyhow, the whole thing reminds me discussions we had some 20 years ago when we started with this ExLing society and conferences, the integration and collaboration of many disciplines.
Yeah.
And because some subjects have good knowledge about some aspect of speech and language and some other. Well, what you said now, the relation between, first, let's start from the very first. On the one hand, we have written language, and on the other hand, we have spoken language, which is the real language. When you go to written language, we have much reduced representations, like a question mark here, a colon there, etc. So you have an enormous reduction, which you compensate using more complicated structure and a lot of more words. So if you haven't found signals, what you call signals in a written language, because it's not the real language. If you analyze spoken language, you will certainly find more. But what more? Not language categories, yes, but prosodic, intonation and prosody. Especially in discourse, in spoken discourse, intonation is the paramount. I mean, it overthrows everything. If you say something with polite words, but an aggressive intonation, the other takes consider the aggressive intonation and not the polite words, right?
Yeah, indeed. I think spoken and written discourse are slightly different. I think you could think of written discourse as a grammaticalization of spoken discourse, and the signals are going to be slightly different. Now, they both have a common system, right? The linguistic system is the same. We just have additional things in each, right? What you do with intonation in speech, you do with punctuation in writing, right? But I think a lot of the phenomena that I've discussed, like reference and semantic relations, are common, right? They're part of the fundamentals of language. And I agree with your first comment that this is certainly an interdisciplinary topic. I have discussed mostly sort of linguistic approaches and discourse kind of approaches, but there are computational approaches to it, and a lot of excellent psycholinguistic work on this, on how we identify relations, how they aid in comprehension, what signals do to comprehension in both written and spoken discourse. So I think it's a really fertile ground for interdisciplinary collaboration in the study of language.
Well, now you said the relation between relations and signals. Let me suggest another term for the sake of discussion. We usually say correlates. Well, it's not important, but correlates. We may have prosodic, as I said, syntactic, lexical, and so. I mean, and in phonetics, it's an old approach now. At the very, very beginning, people thought it was one-to-one. Now we know it's not one-to-many, but it is many-to-many. That's why language is so efficient. We have many-to-many everywhere.
Yeah, so, and yet we manage it and we communicate, fine for the most part.
Yes, precisely. So I'm sure that if you had a prosody expert in your team, your results would. Let's take precisely this, that John left his job, he didn't like, etc. Okay, when you say the first part, if it was finished, you should have a falling intonation, meaning that's the end. But you will have a final rise that is more to come. A forward-looking correlate, Q, which means something more comes. That is your because. This tonal movement corresponds to your because. So you don't have a word, you have something tonal.
Yeah, I agree. I have not studied intonation much, partly because I don't know enough about it. Again, we need experts, but yeah, completely agree. And in writing will be, slightly different signals, but the signals are there. My main point is that the signals are there. We just haven't looked for them.
Precisely. The question is, where are we looking?
Yeah.
That's the main thing. Well,
thank you.
I could talk about those nice things and another thing now you should have in mind for the future. It is when you don't have any lexical, so to say, correlates, and you have only prosodic, okay, what is happening when you have both? I mean, if you have a word correlate, even function word, but there I'm certain that you may have different prosodic associations, meaning different things, which I assume if you have the word correlate of a discourse relation is not single semantic. You may combine with different tonal and prosodic futures implying different relation, and that's the force of language.
Yeah, and sometimes you have redundancy. You have many signals, right? And that you think are extraneous, but they're doing something in the discourse. Yeah, all very good points.
Well, good to
there's
continue
another-
our discussion. I mean,
We also
Happy
are,
to do so.
We
we
also
are
have
going.
Carla.
Athena, is anybody else who?
Yeah,
would-
yes, we have Carla.
Thank you very much, Maite, for your talk. And you've mentioned before that RST can also be extended to multimodal material. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more how it goes and if it was successful or not.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we did some work on written multimodal material. We looked at sort of popular science magazines. We looked at research papers and newspaper articles. And again, all written and all kind of on one page. But we found lots of relations between image and text, caption and image, caption and text. So the captions often have lexical relations, right? Like words that relate to what is said in the text. And in fact, when you write a research paper, you are told, always caption your images and describe them in the text, right? So we have a lot of back and forth there. Those are, sometimes elaboration relations or evidence relations, sometimes motivation in newspaper texts, right? The image is, sort of kind of a motivation or background to understand the rest. In research papers, tables are always used as evidence. Right? So in the text, you say, we find, a correlation between variable A and variable B, as you can see in the table, right? So this was all, as I said, written and sort of relating things that are on the same page, or, the text is on this page and the table is on the next page. John Bateman and colleagues at Bremen have also done work on film, have done work on just images. And it's, really rich work where you can see that there are also relations in, how you move from one image to the next, or the composition of that image, especially in intentionally in images that are shot with a particular composition, as opposed to, just going and taking a picture of what's in the real world, which is also related, right, to each other. So things in the foreground and background, things at the top and the bottom of the image in art as well. You can use some of these things. And Gunter Kress and Theo van Leeuwen have also used principles of systemic functional linguistics to analyze images on art, principles of topic, and so new and given material, and so on. And there's lots of good work on images and how some of them are cultural. So for instance, the left to right reading maybe of images may be very sort of Latin alphabet centric, right? Because we read left to right. So yeah, lots of interesting work on multimodal. We just did a little study.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions.
Okay, then we are closing this session now, and it has been our last lecture for this academic year. Next one, we will meet on September. Well, it was very interesting, and I must say, discourse has been my favorite subject, very, very interesting to study and very chaotic indeed. Thank you very much, Maite, for today. Thank you. We will upload this video onto YouTube so that you can watch at your ease at any time. Please inform our colleagues who might be interested. And thank you, all of you. An applaud, please, for Maite. Bye-bye, and have a lovely summer. Bye-bye.
And thank you to the organizers for this amazing series, not just this talk, but organizing the entire series and keeping us connected throughout the year.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.